But even so, do we now consider such thoughts to be irrelevant? That is, that this country had a very rocky start and not completely Christian in its every thought. Where it must be understood that it wasn't up to the founding fathers to express proper religious thinking to America's occupants at the time, or to be the prime examples of perfect Christian lifestyles, because that task was actually up to the Christian church leaders to teach the populace all about. Our founding fathers simply made the way possible for full religious expression of Christianity in America, of which religion none of them were opposing. And there's absolutely no denying the existence of many, many Christian churches at that period. But where were the other non-Christian establishments, of whom apparently some think the religious freedom spoken of by the founding fathers had also included? In this author's humble opinion, the reins of proper religious expression was commissioned to the Christian Protestants of early revolutionary America by God himself, which included, but wasn't necessarily limited to, and according, that is, to Francis D. Cogliano in his Revolutionary America, Routledge Publishing 2009, on pages 47 and 48, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Quakers, Baptists, Anglicans, Lutherans, German, Reformed, Dutch Reformed, and a host of smaller Christian groups, but not launching from their church governmental systems, which were responsible for religious separations, but of certain people of whom God had commission in every Protestant establishment, who actually represented God's interest in this country from the beginning, but again, of whom were not established by the governed organizational constitutions themselves, where man's hands had formed said separations. Not the congregants, mind, but once again of the man-made governmental structured backbone, as I go over in extreme detail about in my book, The Church and the Fivefold Ministry. Again, we're reading that also in video. And the particular leaders who were responsible for such things. Also, and according to Francis D. Cogliano as well, of over 3,000 churches during these revolutionary times, only about 56 of them were Catholic, leaving the rest, though somewhat diverse in beliefs and denominations, to being Protestant Christians, and in turn lending religious freedom and tolerance strictly to being available for these said Protestant Christians, of which the First Amendment undoubtedly had actually spoke about. The true deep down argument, and as Mark David Hall expresses in his article, isn't if the founding fathers were good Christians or even perfect Christians. It's in determining if Christianity in any form played a major role in the founding of the United States. And there's simply too many solid evidence of that doing so to be ignored or pushed aside. Again, that would be wishful thinking for those who dislike Christianity, or that America had ever been a Christian nation under God, because their arguments against this notion actually, they have no basis in reality. But still, and even so, have the Protestant Christians ever been united in brotherhood? United against tyrannical thinking and acts, against other religions from taking over their religious freedom? Well, again, they had certainly united at the start of this whole thing over religious freedom from the Church of England, but did the buck stop there? Now listen, a kingdom is divided against itself. It cannot stand, as it says in Matthew 12:25. Again, this is why we have ultimately failed God in America. Not that God has failed us. The simple fact that Christians are losing a foothold in this country is just a wake-up call from God, because we as Christians are constantly fighting amongst ourselves, calling each other nasty names over doctrinal differences. But even so, and as I had explained in clear detail in my book on the Church and the Fivefold Ministry, not every Christian leader out there are spiritual Pharisees. They can't be. Else we're all doomed, and nobody would ever be able to reach salvation. Why, though? Because mere man are our saviors? No. But it's because God had chosen the foolishness of preaching, foolishness to man, so that some can be saved, as it says in 1 Corinthians 1:21. Preaching is the vehicle that he chose for that task. And what better place to preach to people than in churches? Why do you think Circe's cronies, like we talked about Circe, circle, in an earlier video, you might want to check that out. Why do you think Circe's cronies like to attack such establishments as churches? It's a great place to gain converts. But even so the case, and once again, this does not make men our saviors. It's the words coming through their mouths, which is actually coming from God, that's really doing the trick. It's only when living water shoot forth from their mouths, which had originated in their spiritual bellies, as it says in the Gospel of John, chapter 7, verse 38, of which belly that I spoke about at the end of chapter 3 in this book. But really, and when we begin to reach a maturing point in our lives, we need to begin working out our own salvation without man's help. See Philippians 2:12b. Taking those spiritually delivered words that were given to us by those anointed preachers and applying them to our lives, given into God's will for ourselves, of course, and allowing God to give us increase unto life eternal. Because men can only plant and water, but it's up to God to give the increase. This is why ministers have to learn when it's time to let go and to give the now grown-up student, over to the Lord for final polishing and for their own ministries with him, without said former ministries still looking over their shoulders, pointing out every little mistake, but to be there for the new minister if they truly need help. Again, spiritual discernment has to be the minister's guide of when the time is right to kick the mature student out of the nest. For that student is not really the minister's child, but it's God's child. The minister only, if I may so say, borrows that child until God's ready for their complete independence. That is, if the student is actually able to reach that point at all. Some may not be able to. Let's look at 1 Corinthians 3:3-9. For you are yet carnal, for whereas there is among you envying and strife and divisions, are you not carnal and walk as fleshly minded men? For while one says, I'm of Paul, and another, I am of Apollos, I'm of this Christian religion, I'm of that Christian religion, are you not carnal? Who is then Paul? Who's Apollos? But ministers by whom you believe, even as the Lord gave to every man. I have planted, Apollos had watered, but God gave the increase. That is, the advanced growth, firstly during their apprenticeship, then especially after those men finally step aside and allow their students to actually reach adulthood. So then, the final result is neither is he that plants anything, neither he that waters is anything, but God is everything who gives the increase. Now he that plants and he that waters are one, united. See, we're a Christian brotherhood, not divided over doctrinal differences. And every man shall receive his own reward according to his own labor. For we are laborers together with God. You are God's husbandry. You are God's building. Now, let's go ahead and get into our second subnote for this very long explanatory note called Natural Buildings Do Make a Difference for Many People. Now, I'm perfectly aware that many particulars have to be worked out in order to come to such a conclusion. For I'm actually at an agreement, and though this may sound contradictory to what I've already expressed, that there really are corrupt Christian churches out in Christendom and that they are to be avoided, especially if they are unreasonable and are unapproachable with sound thinking. The bottom line of this kind of thought certainly has to be that we must investigate them and compare their actions to the Word of God, which is the final say on anything doctrinal, before concluding these people to be absolutely corrupt, but especially to ask God to give us spiritual discernment in that task. See Hebrews 5:14. Because we aren't really capable of making those kind of determinations on our own, that is, with the mind of man. Many people forget this when reasoning situations out in their own minds, their own natural minds. God's ways and thoughts have to become our thoughts before we're capable of such decision making to begin with. Therefore, my words were actually directed toward those who scoff without knowing what they are scoffing at, and are throwing uneducated guesses at other Christians and are condemning them quite unfairly. And I've seen such actions and judgments with my own eyes. I have experienced them personally also. But again, this is simply an explanatory note which veers off from the main topic of this whole book. And though extremely important to biblical study, I am leaving the full book of analysis to my book on the church and the fivefold ministry, Should We Put Our Trust in Man? Again, I'm reading that on video also, that book, which I've mentioned several times already. But most of what I am talking about in this explanatory note is brought out in detail there. So please refer to that book for a satisfactory examination.